Thanks everyone for coming. I know it's always difficult after lunch. Everyone starts to get that food coma. So hopefully we'll have an interesting topic that you guys will learn some things about password security and things that you may not have known before. So this is a little bit of a strange topic to have at BriForum because traditionally all the topics are about terminal services and VDI and these types of topics. But of course, most of us that have implemented some form of VPN access and terminal services and VDI, we always have to worry about authentication and how people get into the environment and what happens if somebody was compromising someone else's credentials. So what this session is about, and this is something I've actually wanted to do for a couple of years now, because I'm a very strong believer that the notion of using passwords and authentication mechanism is really quite antiquated and is not something that's going to really carry us forward the next few years. So the presentation title is Passwords Are Dead. Two-factor authentication is here for the masses. And I'm going to talk about this both from a consumer perspective and an enterprise perspective. So I think there's going to be something that's applicable to everyone regardless. So if you're active on Twitter, you can tweet about the session using the BriForum hashtag, BriForum 2013, and my Twitter handle, which is @Shawn. So really quickly, something about myself. I spend about 90% of my time in the field doing consulting. Most of my clients are in the Chicago area. Most of them are Fortune 500 large companies. I don't do a lot of SMB-based consulting, so sometimes the things that I'm focused on or the things that I talk about are really more enterprise play conversations and not really SMB specific. I do a lot of speaking at events like BriForum and Citrix Synergy and VMworld and those types of things. I also do an independent training class with Dr. Benny Trich on terminal services and Zen app and Zen desktop. And then lastly, I do a desktop virtualization roadshow about 10 times a year in cooperation with TechTarget, where I talk about trends within desktop virtualization, what's happened over the last 5 years, and kind of which way we're headed in the future. So the agenda for this session is we're first going to cover what is it about passwords that are fundamentally broken. I mean, everyone obviously understands the very general problems about the fact that if somebody hacks your password or if you lose your password or something like that, that you can be compromised and someone can take over your identity and those kind of things. But I want to talk a bit more about what specifically is wrong with the password concept. We'll talk a little bit about how two-factor authentication works. And of course, each implementation is a little bit different, but the general constructs are all the same. We'll talk about what two-factor is really good about protecting and also what it's not good for protecting. Because I think there's a lot of confusion in the industry about what two-factor actually does for you and the places where it's most applicable and the places where it really doesn't help your security all that much. And then I'll have a section where we'll talk about protecting yourself as a consumer. Regardless of your enterprise affiliation or small business affiliation, every one of us in this room is a consumer. We all use services like Dropbox and Evernote and iCloud and Google Play and all these kinds of things. So I want to make sure we talk a little bit about how do we protect ourselves as consumers regardless of what the company is doing with their particular assets. And then we'll focus a little bit on protecting the business. And if you are building a VDI or terminal server environment or even a corporate VPN, what are some potential integrations you can do for two-factor and what some of the common vendors are and kind of how they work. And if time permits, we'll cover a little bit of additional security info. So what is it about passwords that are really broken? Why are passwords broken? Number one, the average user has 26 password protected accounts. Now in this room, because we're IT-focused people, this could probably be closer to 50 or 60 or 80 password protected accounts. In addition, a lot of the things around OpenID and that kind of stuff never really came to fruition for a large number of these services that we use. So we end up having unique passwords and user accounts and all of these different web real estates. And of course, the bigger problem in my mind, not so much the number of accounts we're managing, but the fact that the average user only has 5 passwords that they use across those 26 accounts. So I'm not going to ask people in the room how many of you use the same password on multiple sites, but I'm pretty confident there's a good percentage of us in this room that are reusing passwords on multiple websites. And this is a very, very dangerous practice, and we'll talk a bit about why. Another area of why passwords are broken is most users don't understand what entropy is all about. And entropy is sort of a mathematical term that gets applied to this information security premise of password entropy. And what it basically means is the predictability about what the next character in a particular password is going to be. And you could certainly say that the entropy is somewhat dependent on just random selection. Like you can say, oh, if I just pick a generic number or generic letter or generic symbol, I'm going to eventually figure out the person's password. But there's actually a mathematical probability you can use to calculate the likelihood of the next character in the password based on the previous and all these kind of things. So what we're going to cover is sort of how password entropy relates to the strength of a password, both for the length as well as the character set, and how that kind of varies and how it makes the attacking of that password more difficult in certain scenarios. There's also been a lot of high-profile password thefts in the last few years. And of course, if you go back, in the mid-90s when the internet was really started taking off, there really weren't that many people that were on any particular internet site. Of course, you had some web mail sites like Yahoo and that kind of stuff that might be ripe attack targets. But now you take any off-the-shelf service like an Instagram or Twitter or something like that, and there are literally tens of millions or hundreds of millions of users of these services. So they become real ripe targets for somebody to attack and try to get those credentials. And because of the first two things we talked about, the number of sites that people have and the number of times they reuse passwords, if you compromise somebody in one site, you effectively may have compromised them on 20 other sites or 50 other sites, depending on how many they're using that same password on. As I said, the weakest link exposes them all. If you reuse your password on 25 different sites and somebody compromises any one of them, that password will be used on other sites with your credential. And I think one of the frustrating things for me about the password reuse perspective is many websites people log in with, they typically will use their email account as their identity on those sites. And then when they use that common password, it's very easy for a hacker or attacker, once they have that credential, to just substitute in well-known sign-in URLs for the most popular 100 web services, and next thing you know, they've got logins to all these different locations for these people. So password entropy. It's the measure of uncertainty in a particular random variable within a password. So depending on the character set you have, the key space that you have, whether it's uppercase, lowercase, numbers, symbols, that affects the entropy. And I pull this comic from XKCD because it's actually quite a good explanation at a fairly low level of what password entropy is all about. Now, the way they calculate entropy here is actually based on a mathematical entropy calculation that isn't really directly related to password entropy. But the effective thing is you take a complex password, and a lot of us over the last 10 or 15 years have been told that you need to make complex passwords. So uppercase, lowercase, symbols, all sorts of crazy nonsense, digits, everything. And so you've got this troubadour password that looks like it would be a pretty complex password that nobody would be able to attack. On the surface, it seems that way. In reality, when you focus on the amount of entropy in there, and again, this calculation is off a bit, but they're saying it's 28 bits of entropy. And the big problem is, as the end user, you're sitting or saying to yourself, okay, was it trombone? Was it troubadour? Was there a ampersand? Or was it an @ symbol? Like, I can't remember. I think the 0 might be a O, or I don't know. I'm not quite sure what it was. So the end result is the user can't remember the password they created because it's too complex. On the other hand, if you used a passphrase like this, correct horse battery staple, which, by the way, don't ever use this one because this is in every single password list that attackers will use because of this comic. But in theory, if you take 4 random words like this and combine them together, you end up with an entropy that is much higher. The probability of being able to brute force or guess every character of this password becomes more difficult. And this is true, by the way, even though the key space or the pattern of characters that are selected in this password is more simple. And the reason why it's important is because even though we have all lowercase letters here, the attacker who's trying to brute force a password doesn't know if I'm using lowercase or uppercase or symbols or anything like that. So the attacker will have to do one of two things. He either has to do some low-level attacks, assuming you just use lowercase, which may or may not yield a result. Or they go with the most complex key space, which is 95 characters, which is every character set on the keyboard, and then they run the risk of the brute force takes a very, very long time. In addition, this password is so long that it is literally impossible to brute force this password. And it doesn't matter whether you have graphics cards working on it. It doesn't matter if you have a distributed grid of 100 or 1,000 computers. You will not brute force this password in 100 years. It's that long. It's that hard to brute force. Brute forcing passwords is only effective, even with distributed clusters, up to about 6 to 8 characters. So at that kind of a password length, when you get something like this, brute force is not your biggest issue. So it's really important to understand that the length of the password is really the important thing, not so much the key space and the complexity of the password. That's not to say that you should not put complex characters in occasionally, particularly if you have a password management tool that will keep track of this for you. But it's way more important that you have passwords that are long than passwords that are complex. And the most important thing about this passphrase method is that it's very easy to remember. The joke in the XKCD is that you've already memorized the password by the end of the comic. But again, don't use that one because it's in every single password list out there. So we'll discuss the math a little bit behind entropy and how this works. There is a researcher named Claude Shannon that introduced the concept of password entropy in a 1948 paper called The Mathematical Theory of Communication. And effectively how it works is the true password entropy, or how you calculate the randomness of the password, is a function of the key space and the password length. And it's actually a base 2 logarithmic function. So each character's entropy is equal to log base 2 times n, and that's a per character entropy basis. So n is your key space, which is either going to be a situation where you have digits, so 0 to 9, which gives you 10 potential characters, so you get 3.32 bits of entropy per character. Then if you add in lowercase letters, it's A through Z, so you have a 26 character selection pool, which gives you 4.7 bits of entropy. Obviously, the greater entropy we have, the less likely it is that somebody will guess the password or crack it. If you take all numbers, all letters and numbers, so uppercase A through Z, lowercase a through Z, and 0 through 9, you have a 62 character key space, which means the entropy is 5.95 bits. And again, as the entropy gets larger and larger, it becomes much more difficult to guess the password through brute forcing mechanism. And then lastly, if you take all possible keyboard characters, ignoring Unicode, just normal keyboard characters, you have a key space of 95 characters, which is 6.57 bits of entropy. And again, this is on a per character basis that you calculate the entropy. So when you're trying to figure this out for an entire password, you end up taking the per character entropy times the length. So as an example, if I have an 8 character password from 95 characters, I have a 52.56 bit entropy. And you can also compute that out as what is the total number of possibilities that password could be made up of. And in this case, it's 95 to the 8th power, or some ridiculously long number of possibilities. And all that basically means is if somebody's trying to brute force the password, when they're brute forcing it, the computer basically just goes in and says, okay, the password is A, then it tries B, then it tries C, and it just does this ad nauseum until it finds the combination of letters and numbers and symbols that reaches the point where the password is then discovered. Interestingly enough, we take a 12-character password from a 26-character key space. So now we have a much smaller key space, which typically would imply a lower level of entropy, which is easier to break. But because we have 12 characters, we now have a 56-bit entropy. And if you do the math on that, 26 to the 12th power gives you a number that is, of course, much greater than the other great number that sounded, in crazy amount of numbers that you couldn't possibly break. So the important thing of the password entropy is that it is more important to make sure that you have a long password than you have a complex password. And this is sort of counterintuitive to what everyone has been told over the last 10 or 15 years, that you must mix numbers and letters and all these kind of crazy things. And what really frustrates me about a lot of online websites that have solutions for choosing complex passwords is many times they say, oh, you have to have a uppercase letter, you have to have a digit, you have to have a symbol, you have to have all this stuff, oh, but maximum 6 characters. And you're like, what? Congratulations on making me jump through hoops on having a crazy password, but that thing can be brute forced in a matter of a couple of minutes or hours, depending on your compute power. Very important thing too, every password ultimately is going to be obtainable if the person is motivated enough. And by motivated enough, I mean that they're going to potentially do physical harm against you to obtain that. So this is another great XKCD comic that I really like. It's kind of the perspective of what a computer nerd would think about how encryption or security would work, where they say, oh, his laptop's encrypted. Let's build $1 million cluster to crack the encryption key. No good, it's 49.6-bit RSA. We'll never crack it. Blast, our evil plan is foiled. What really would happen is the guy says, oh, his laptop's encrypted. Drug him and hit him with this $5 wrench until he tells us the password. I mean, that's the reality of what would happen if you were somewhere that somebody really wanted your information, right? So password complexity and security and all that kind of stuff is great, but at the end of the day, if you're really a high-value target, they're going to get your password no matter what. Now, there are some very creative ways of hiding this where you can have certain types of disk encryption solutions that actually, when you unlock them with one password, it shows a different view of the file system when you unlock it with the other password. So you can do things like that where you can say, oh yeah, here's the password, have at it. And then they're looking through it and they're like, we thought we were going to find something more interesting on here, but it looks like this is just pictures of your kids. Oh, sorry about that. Anyway, so let's talk a bit about how passwords are obtained, because there's many different ways that an attacker can obtain somebody's password in order to get at their information. So one of them, of course, is if the person does something stupid like write their password down on a Post-it note or fixed to their monitor or underneath their keyboard or something like that. This obviously, if you have physical access to the region, very easy to walk by, grab it, whatever. The modern day version of this, of course, is somebody keeping track of passwords in a plain text file or inside Evernote, which, Evernote's a great service, but people have to realize that while Evernote does do encryption in transit of your data through SSL, when the data actually drops into Evernote's file system on their servers, it is unencrypted. So if anyone ever did go in and swoop and grab Evernote's database that contains your information, anything that's in there is clear text for the taking. Now, there are ways of doing encrypted notes within Evernote that do use a master encryption key that you can protect data. But I always tell people, be very careful about storing sensitive data like passwords and credit card numbers and that kind of stuff in sites like Dropbox and Evernote and these kinds of things, because they don't necessarily have the level of security or encryption that you might want. The next way that these passwords can be obtained is either through a person, being on the telephone with somebody and announcing their password. Like sometimes people will call, a bank or somebody like that, and they're like, oh yeah, my account password is blah, 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 and they tell them over the phone. And sometimes this is just somebody not realizing they're being overheard, and sometimes it's somebody who's actually being social engineered. And the problem with social engineering, from my perspective, is it is so incredibly easy to social engineer users at a company. I've done this before intentionally to try to see if a person would give up some information. And all you really have to do is just say you're calling from the help desk, you're calling from the network team. You say there's this abnormality in the network in your region. Are your applications slow? And 99% of the time the users go, yes, everything is really slow today. Well, if you give me your password, I want to log in and check something on the network. We'll do a quick network capture. We'll see if we can find the root cause of the performance problem, and then we'll call you back and let you know it's all fixed. Oh, okay, no problem. Here's my password. Boom. And the person is compromised. Most people have information security practices where they tell their users not to do these things, but that doesn't mean that they're actually successful. Many times users just give it up way too easy. By the way, while we're talking about being social engineered, does everyone know the Matt Honan story from Wired? Matt Honan was a very unfortunate result of a situation of companies that were social engineered. Matt Honan was an editorial author for Wired magazine, and he had all of his services connected up with common account, user account email names. Now, he didn't have common passwords across all the services. However, he did have a lot of these services set up, and Amazon and Apple and all these companies have this where you can call in and say, oh, I'm locked out of my account. Can you please send me a new password? Or can you please reset my account so I can get in? Now, most companies are supposed to go through verification of your security codes or some kind of personal identifiable information. And in this case, in the case of Matt Honan, they were able to get to his Gmail account and his Apple ID as part of social engineering Apple and Google to give up a reset of his account. So what happened in Matt's case, which is very unfortunate, is once the person got a hold of the Gmail account, they were basically able to go through and try to perform resets of the other services, which then, of course, would send a notification saying, hey, somebody has reset your password. And since they own the Gmail account, they just deleted it before it ever reached the guy's phone, so he never noticed that they were compromising system after system. And eventually they went through and they wiped his iPhone. He had Find My Mac enabled, which also allows you to wipe the Mac. So they wiped his Mac. They basically deleted everything off of his computer and his phone and all of his accounts, and it was a very sad story. Unfortunately, when these companies are being social engineered, there's not much you as an individual can do. Your only hope is that these companies are doing a better job to protect their policies around when they'll allow resets and what verification they perform. However, two-factor authentication can preserve or protect some of this from happening in the first place. The next way that passwords can be obtained is what's called session hijacking. And session hijacking is made very, very popular with the tool Firesheep. I'm not sure how many of you guys are aware of Firesheep, but basically it's a Firefox extension that works like this. If you're in a Starbucks or some other well-known coffee shop sitting on the open unencrypted Wi-Fi, and you're using Facebook and Twitter and all these other kind of things, if you are not using those services in an SSL protected envelope, and you're just authenticating to them in HTTP form, anyone who's sitting in the open Wi-Fi can intercept your communication with the server, and they're not necessarily going to be able to get your password because a lot of these services will SSL encrypt the logon process, but they don't necessarily SSL encrypt the entire end-to-end session. So what ends up happening is you can hijack the cookie that the person is using to communicate with the web server, at which point in time the attacker goes to the web server impersonating the user by using their cookie, and they now become them on the same server. At the point in time that they have possessed your session cookie and they've hijacked your session, they can then perform a password reset and do whatever they want. So session hijacking is a very, very big problem. The next one is you can use a man-in-the-middle network sniffing device like a Wi-Fi Pineapple. This is a device you can get off of Hack5 for I think around like $200 or $300. I have one at home, I just did not bring it with me. But effectively what it is it's a man-in-the-middle Wi-Fi attack device that has a default configuration that it responds to well-known SSIDs as being the source of the access point. So almost every iPhone on the market will automatically connect to ATT Wi-Fi because if you get an iPhone on ATT, they put that in there as a pre-configured Wi-Fi hotspot that you can connect to without authentication, without encryption, and you just connect to the internet. Same thing with Apple Store, same thing with a lot of coffee shops, Panera, Starbucks, whatever. The risk that you have in this, of course, is the Wi-Fi Pineapple device, when you power it on, it will basically answer any device's response asking for an open Wi-Fi account that has been configured on the Wi-Fi Pineapple. So I could simultaneously be answering requests from 100 different phones and tablets and computers, all saying, yeah, I'm AT&T Wi-Fi, yeah, I'm Starbucks, yes, I'm Hyatt, yes, I'm Hilton, yes, I'm whoever. And every single time somebody's device tries to connect one of those open access points, they start passing all their traffic through me. At the point in time they start passing their traffic through me, I can do whatever I want with it. If it's not SSL secured traffic, I can pull passwords, I can impersonate the user and session hijack, I can redirect them to alternate pages that might look like the site that they're trying to go to, but is really my attack web server, many different things. And by the way, a lot of you would probably say, well, what's the big deal? Because this is only with open access points, and if I'm not using Wi-Fi, then I'm not susceptible to this. Research was just presented in the last couple of months. Actually, I think it's the last couple of days, as a matter of fact, at Black Hat this week. Research is being presented where people have used hacked Verizon femtocells, which are 3G extension towers, that they're able to use the femtocell to intercept 3G, 4G communication in the exact same way. So even if you think, well, I won't use Wi-Fi, I'll only use the cellular tower, well, you can also be compromised on that. And there's always been the capability to create rogue cell access towers as well. Now keep in mind, these are very determined attackers, because if you're ever discovered impersonating a cellular tower, very, very steep fines with that. Wi-Fi is sometimes forgiven as like, oh, he was just screwing around. But if you're actually capturing or impersonating a cellular tower, you can get in a lot of trouble for that. But the point being is there are ways to get that information. And then the last method that you can use to compromise a user or get their credentials and steal their information is through a rogue USB device. And there's really two forms of these that are popular. One of them is you have a rogue USB device that the person plugs into their machine, and upon inserting it, it uses the autoplay facility to execute some malicious code. Once the machine is compromised with some well-known vulnerability, you own the machine, you can examine all traffic, you can examine everything that's on that machine. This is why it's always a strong recommendation to never insert a USB drive you find laying around in a parking lot or something like that, because if an attacker wants to get a certain company, they may even figure out what kind of USB devices people are using from that company and get their same type of, same kind of USB key fob, or even one with printed with the same logo to make it look like it's a corporate device, drop it on the driveway or drop it in the pavement. Somebody finds it and says, oh, this is my company's USB drive. I'll put it in my computer at work to find out whose it is so I can return it to them, which seems like the genuine good thing to do. Unfortunately, then they've just compromised a corporate machine by installing the malware on the machine. The second type of USB device attack you can do, which is very effective, there is a device called a USB rubber ducky, which can also be had from Hack5 for like $100. And what the USB rubber ducky does is it's a human interface device, so it basically emulates a keyboard, just like a regular USB keyboard does. However, you can code payloads in USB rubber ducky to execute whatever you want. Now, this one is typically fairly easy to uncover what's happening, because when the payload runs from USB rubber ducky, it's effectively emulating hitting keyboard keystrokes. So when you plug this thing in, you can sort of see it happening. But in some cases, it happens so fast you can't even do anything to prevent it. So that can be a very bad way. The important thing about all of these attacks, which I think is actually good for most of us, is that all of these attacks are either targeted attacks, meaning a hacker or attacker has to specifically be trying to attack you or somebody in your company or something like that, or they have to be within close proximity. All the man-in-the-middle stuff I talked about with the Wi-Fi Pineapple device and that kind of stuff and Firesheet, they all require you to be on unencrypted Wi-Fi sitting in the vicinity of somebody who's trying to attack you. Now, don't kid yourself to think that there aren't these devices at all sorts of coffee shops you guys are sitting at. This is a very, very common problem. And that's why I always suggest to people, if you are going to use unencrypted Wi-Fi, it's a really good idea to at least make sure everything you're using uses SSL or HTTPS, wherever the configuration settings are for the web application. Or if your company has the facility, make sure you kick off a VPN connection and make sure everything goes to the VPN tunnel. At least then you've got one level of SSL encryption that is protecting your communication, even if the applications you're using are not protecting your login. So what are some other ways that passwords are obtained? Of course, any method of attacks that are done on web servers or database servers, over the last 5 or 10 years, SQL injection has been one of the most common ways of compromising web servers, actually compromising database servers via web servers. And there have been countless number of attacks. I can't even sum up the grand total of the number of websites that have been attacked over the last 5 or 10 years. It is monumental in number. In addition, we talked a little bit before about password reuse and the dangers of that. Once you've been compromised in one place, you're of course able to be, those credentials are able to be used everywhere else that you use any other services. So Dropbox, Gmail, everything, they're going to attempt to use that. And keep in mind too that the hackers are very good at getting a hold of passwords. They're also very good at testing a password once they've found it. So don't think that once the hacker gets it, you're like, oh, well, they have to know which 20 services I use out of the 4,000 potential ones. They've got scripts that automate the authentication with the sample password. So they can just plunk it in there, and within like 3 or 4 minutes, they've already authenticated to 100 or 200 different web services and found out exactly where that password is usable. So this takes a very, very small amount of time to identify. Brute force is sort of the last method. If somebody wants to get a hold of your password, they can brute force it. And in brute force, there's really 2 different models that can be employed. There's an online brute force attack, which basically means they're going to emulate through some kind of a script, pretending to log into the website the same way that you would. So they're going to go to the web form, they're going to fill in your user ID, and they're going to put in some keywords from a dictionary, or they're going to try brute forcing a password and just keep trying one time after another after another. Now, some online attacks are not very useful because some web servers or applications are properly designed to sort of gate the number of attempts that can be accessed at one time. So they'll either lock the account out or they'll do a temporary lockout of the authentication mechanism. So in the physical peripheral world, a good example of this is if you try to brute force a PIN on an iPhone. Of course, a 4-digit PIN, which most cell phones use, there's only 10,000 possible combinations you can do. Now you think to yourself, like, who's going to sit there on somebody's phone and go, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 5, 1, 2, 3, 6. That sounds crazy, right? However, there have been cell phones recovered, and people have created devices with 3D printers that are basically robotic machines that just push buttons on the phone to try to brute force it until they find it. In addition, the USB rubber ducky device I showed you a little while ago, because it's a human interface device, it emulates a keyboard. So there is a script you can use with the USB rubber ducky, connect it to an Android phone, and I specifically say Android because Android is a platform that only locks out your attempt for 30 seconds after you mistype it like 4 times. And then after the 30 seconds goes by, it lets you try again, 4 more times before it locks you out for 30 seconds. So in the case of Android, you can brute force the passcode on an Android device within 16 hours with a USB rubber ducky and a piece of script code. Because you just create the code to try each pattern, and then you sleep 30 seconds in between the retries, and you keep going until you found the PIN. And of course, you may find it in less than 16 hours if it's a low-digit number. In the case of iOS, they did a little bit better job at this because when you're trying to brute force the PIN code, it just keeps getting longer and longer duration. So while you can brute force an iOS device, it ultimately means it's going to take you a substantial amount of time to do that. I don't know exactly how long. I've never looked at exactly how far out the iOS devices go before that would be feasible, but I would imagine it would probably be in the weeks to brute force it. Now, the key thing to keep in mind is people often don't have to worry about brute forcing a device because there are ways of taking an iOS device and dumping the contents off. So if you do that, you might get what you're looking for without actually getting direct UI access. So it all depends on what you're after. So we talked about online attacks that can be done against web servers, and oftentimes those are gated. You might get maybe 100 password attempts per second at best before the website either gets overwhelmed or locks you out or something like that. And then there's offline attacks. What's interesting about offline attacks is there's absolutely nothing that prohibits you from doing as many password tests as you can given a set of hardware that you have. So what an offline attack basically means is I get a copy of somebody's database that contains everybody's password hashes, and we'll talk a bit more about hashing algorithms and what that all means. But effectively, a hash is a one-way encryption mechanism that scrambles a value into something that looks like a very long string of characters. Once you have somebody's hash, You can't reverse a hash back to a number, or at least it's not been figured out yet how to reverse MD5 or SHA-1 hashing. But once you have the hash itself, what you can do instead is start generating passwords, hashing them, and comparing the hash to the hash. And when you find a hash that matches their hash, you effectively know their password. You just did it in reverse versus being able to pass the password in and encrypt it. Or hash it, I should say. So offline cracking, you can oftentimes do billions of password attempts per second. Billions. So it becomes a matter of time that even when we said there's 6 trillion password combinations for this particular user, if I'm able to try a billion combinations per second, it doesn't take me that long to find somebody's hash. So this is effectively what happens with offline attacks. And then there's, of course, brute force attempts, which is just try every single character until we find it. And there's different methods to do each of those we'll talk about. And the last one, of course, since this is in the news recently, the NSA has ways of getting things. Of course, they probably have all of our passwords, and they're probably listening right now, and all that kind of good stuff. Anyway, let's talk about high-profile attacks. So RockU is one of the most well-known online attacks that happened back in 2009. There were 32 million clear text passwords that were exposed. Now, what's cool about this is they didn't use any kind of hashing at all with the password storage. So once you got the RockU database, you effectively had 32 million user accounts and a clear text password for every single user. So once you've got that, you don't even have to do any work. The work's already been done for you. You got the passwords. And what's really important about RockU is this was one of the first attacks that there were a massive number of users that were exposed, and it gave attackers great visibility into how people create passwords. Why? Because now they had 32 million examples of what typical everyday people do to create passwords. This was the model for password dictionary attacks for many, many years to come. Then we had Sony in 2011. These are just a couple examples. There's hundreds of examples out there. But Sony in 2011. We had Monster.com in 2009. We had Sony in 2011 again. We had LinkedIn, 6.5 million unencrypted again. Nice work, LinkedIn. And June 2012. We had Sony again in 2011. Heck, Sony was hacked over 10 times in 2011 for a grand total of 100 million accounts exposed by Sony. So what else do we have up here? We have Yahoo Mail, we have Dropbox, we have Zappos, Yahoo Mail, Living Social, BattleNet, Twitter, lots of people. So what does this mean? This means, A, if any of us have accounts on any of these things, there's a good possibility that one of us was compromised, or multiple of us were compromised. There's a website out there called I think it's like Information is Beautiful, that has a nice little pictorial that kind of shows you. And this only goes down to 2011, but their actual web page goes down to like 2006 or 2005 or something like that. But it gives you a visual representation of what some of the high-profile targeted attacks were and what the size of the data leakage was in each of these companies. Now, some companies, like in the case of Ubisoft here, didn't actually disclose how many accounts were affected because from their perspective, they don't want to air the dirty laundry, and they certainly don't want to know, let the attackers or other people potentially know how many accounts were compromised. And in many cases, what these services do, in the case of Evernote, they just issue a mass password reset, tell everyone to please sign back in, use this new password, we're very sorry about the compromise. But at the end of the day, your passwords will get compromised whether or not you have a complex password or an easy password or whatever. Because in this circumstance, it has nothing to do with how secure your password is. All it has to do with is how weak the information security practices of these guys are. So that's what it really comes down to. So I got a short link here if anyone wants to see the biggest breaches of all companies in sort of this pictogram form. It gives you a nice idea of kind of how this works. So let's talk about methods of password verification. This is how a developer or website owner can find ways to verify your identity when you sign into a system. Now, one of them is, of course, clear text authentication. And in clear text, you type your password in, you may be SSL encrypting the communication between the client and the web server, but once that is received on the web server side, it just does a SQL query to say, is Shawn's password equal to Shawn's password, because it's password in both places. Yes, it matches, therefore allow Shawn in. The problem is once somebody compromises a clear text password database, they literally have zero work to take those passwords and then reuse them against other targets because it's just there in clear text. The second mechanism is a hashing mechanism. And hashing, as I said, is sort of like an encryption thing, but unlike encryption that's reversible, it's a one-way mangling of the data so that you can't take a hash and convert it back to the original password. And one of the best analogies of how to describe this is people think about, like, you take a cow, right? And you can turn a cow into a hamburger, but you can't turn a hamburger back into a cow. Or at least I haven't figured out how yet. But that would be a good example of how hashing is comparable to like a common everyday thing. Very typical method is hashing is what people use. Most websites will either use an MD5 hash or a SHA-1 hash. These are just different hashing algorithms. And there's some arguments or discussions about, what is an effective hashing algorithm, and it all depends on what your requirements are. But most people have come to the conclusion that MD5 and SHA-1 have become too weak of hashing mechanisms, either due to collisions or due to the fact that they're a very fast hashing algorithm, which makes them susceptible to breaking the hash by mass calculating similar hashes and comparing the passwords. So as I said, this is not the same as reversible encryption. You can never go back to the original password. But what you can do is you can take randomly generated passwords and build hashes based upon them, and then check those hashes against the hashes that you've downloaded from the website. And this is typically what happens once a leak has been done of a website where hashes were obtained but passwords were not obtained, is that these lists get uploaded to servers where hackers can then download them and test their skills to see how many of the hash passwords they can break by generating new hash passwords and comparing until they find the actual password. The reality is, when it comes to MD5 and SHA-1, most organizations can typically find anywhere between 80 to 95% of those passwords given enough time. When I say given enough time, some of them will fall in a matter of seconds, some of them may take days, some of them may take weeks, all depending on the compute power of the person who's generating the hashes.
Still irrespective of length?
Exactly. The length thing can definitely help, and that will be probably one of the last ones that falls. Like if you have a 40-character password, you will not find the equivalent hash that's gonna relate to that password. It's impossible, because when you do this hash generation process, you're gonna basically go out there and say, okay, create me a hash for the word password, and you're gonna get the hash, and you're gonna compare that hash to the list of things that you have. That's an easy way to do it. But if you're not gonna generate 40-character password hashes, because that takes a computationally large amount of time and power, so you would leave those to the very end. So if somebody has a 40-character password, you're probably not gonna find that through matching hashes. We'll talk about salts in just a minute. You're getting ahead. I'll get there 1 second. Well, since you brought up salts, let's talk about salts really quick. What a salt basically does, and we haven't talked about salting yet, but a salt is a predetermined piece of text that you're going to append either at the end or prepend the password with to make a new hash out of something that makes it different. So if the word password came out to be this particular hash, if I take the word password and add a 14-character salt that I've generated on my own, the hash will no longer be the same as the original password hash. All salting effectively does is prevent something called rainbow tables from being successful. And we haven't talked about rainbow tables yet, but effectively what a rainbow table is remember I told you guys RockU was broken with 32 million passwords? Somebody went out and took all 32 million passwords and generated hashes for all 32 million. Such that if another site falls and that hash shows up, I already have pre-computed the hash for that same password. I have zero work to do to obtain that password. That's effectively what rainbow tables are. But rainbow tables aren't only based on known passwords, they're based on pre-generated random passwords that can just be random characters, maybe up to 12 characters in length. I can generate a hash for every single possible password up to 12 characters. And anyone who has a password less than 12 characters, I can know your password as soon as I have the hash, because I can match it to what's in the rainbow table. What salts effectively do is prevent somebody from using a rainbow table to match those hashes, because the salt will change every single hash by some undetermined pattern, which means that I can't then take that list and compare it against the known hashes that I pre-calculated. So that's effectively what salting does. We'll talk about that again a little bit later. The most important thing is if you are a person responsible for web security and you are going to create salts, you probably want to make sure that you use random per user salts as opposed to one common salt, because if somebody figures out what your one common salt is, they can just generate an entire new salt table, and then it becomes less effective. So if you generate a random salt for each user and store that in the database, you can then use that to have a separate salt.
If you have an unsalted password, it's really easy. You just take the MD5 and the SHA-1 and plug it into Google.
Yes.
And it will then tell you the passwords, because Google's indexed all these tables.
I actually have an example showing that in just 1 second. So, so the important thing about hashing algorithms is there are some hashing algorithms like MD5, SHA-1, and NTLM that are computationally very, very inexpensive. And what that effectively means is that I can calculate billions of hashes on a modern computer or a computer with a GPU. So if I have this massive list of password hashes and I need to figure out what the passwords are for 32 million users, I can generate hashes for every known password up to 12 characters, compare the hashes against what I downloaded, and I can probably match 40, 60% right off the cuff, no problems whatsoever. So the problem with these hashes is that they're computationally inexpensive, which means I can generate billions of these without a lot of processing power. What's bad about that is if somebody does get my hashes, it doesn't take them very long to figure out what my users' passwords are. There are other hash algorithms like bcrypt, PBKDF2, and scrypt that are computationally expensive. And it doesn't mean that necessarily if you're building a website or some kind of a service that it's going to like bring your servers down because you've used bcrypt or scrypt or whatever. It just means that it may take, let's say, 100 milliseconds to verify a password hash, whereas before it might have been like a tenth of a microsecond or a picosecond or something like that. So computationally, that 100 milliseconds in the grand scheme of your whole website load time is irrelevant. However, if somebody gets your hashes, the fact that it takes a picosecond to generate a hash becomes very, very important. If it takes 100 milliseconds, now it's going to take the attacker a substantially longer amount of time to figure out what my users' passwords are from the hashes that they stole from me. So computationally expensive hashes are a very important way of protecting data. We talked a little bit about what salting basically does. Salting makes it more difficult for the attacker to figure out when they have a password match or to use pre-computed rainbow tables to be able to figure out a mass amount of hashes at the same time. So we already talked a little bit about common salts or unique salts. You want to use a unique salt per user, and you can store the salt in the database. It doesn't matter if the attacker has the salt and has the hashing algorithm, because they still have to compute it each time for every single hash, which makes it take a lot longer. So hashing and salting, really quick example of how this works. I'm going to use MD5 because a majority of websites out there use MD5 or SHA-1. So effectively, this is how it works. I've got a user named Bob, and Bob performed an MD5 of this word password. And right, that's super complex because we've all been told uppercase, lowercase, digits, and symbols means I'm secure, right? So when I calculate, and this is, you can use these MD5 hash algorithms free online. There's online generators for MD5 hash. So this is the real MD5 hash of this password here. Interestingly enough, Mary, another user on my web service, also uses the exact same complex password that Bob used, and she gets, ironically, the same hash. No kidding. It's a mathematical function. It's going to return the same result. As John said, you plug that into Google, and guess what? Google returns a result that says this hash is equal to the MD5 of this password. Voila, you've got what you need. And while I did this manually through Google, you can, of course, create your own web crawlers that do all this work for you automatically and build your nice password list based on your MD5s. Now, let's talk about what happened if we salted it. Now, I just generated this random character salt, and salts can be, as long as you want. The thing you don't want to do is have a small number of salts or have too short of a salt, because then it doesn't become mathematically unique enough. But if I have a very long salt like this, and it's unique, what basically happens is, my clicker stops working. Bob is now going to have an MD5 of his password plus the salt that I've generated. Now his MD5 hash is going to be this. And notice that this hash is not the same as that hash because we've added the salt. We've now made it something different, but the hash is now going to be unique. And because of that, Mary, if we use the same salt for Mary, she ends up with the same MD5. Now, this is still better than what we had up here because it's at least a different hash. However, if somebody steals the hashes and they figure out that the hash plus the salt gives them E8, E2, blah, 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 they now know not only Bob, but they also know Mary's password. So I still have weaknesses of users with the same common passwords being discovered simultaneously because somebody cracked one of the hashes. The good news is, though, if I Google search for this hash plus salt or the password plus salt hash, it will not turn up in Google results. Why? Because nobody has pre-computed the hash for that user's password plus that unique salt. It's impossible to pre-compute rainbow tables for enough combinations of passwords plus dynamically randomly generated salts. There's not enough computational power or storage to put all of those in a rainbow table. So it's just not feasible. However, if I did unique per user salts, this gives me one more advantage, because now I do the same thing for Bob. I give him the same salt. He gets that same MD5 hash. But now for Mary, I give her the same password, but I use a unique randomly generated salt for her, and she now ends up with a separate MD5 hash that is different from Bob's hash. Now, if an attacker had got a hold of my hashes and they figured out Bob's password, Mary's would still be protected even though she had a same password, but the salt gave me a level of protection that someone wasn't able to crack 10 or 20 or 30 users at the exact same time. So this is why you want to use random salts when you store your passwords. And again, having these salts stored in the database is not necessarily a horrible thing, because all you're trying to do is slow down the attacker from figuring out the passwords once they crack one of them. That's the only purpose of salting. And again, when I go to query Mary's salted hashed password, I also don't come up with any results in Google as expected. Let's talk about different types of password attacks. We kind of already talked before about the difference between an online attack and an offline attack. The important thing about online attacks is they're typically gated. Either my web platform or my database platform or something to prevent too many simultaneous login attempts with different passwords. Maybe it locks the account out. Maybe it notifies the user, hey, somebody's trying to sign on with your account. They misused their password too many times, whatever the case may be. Important thing too, if the information security team of the web platform is worth anything, they will be noticing this and potentially, notify the user, lock out the user, do whatever, even if there's not a programmatic gating put in place. They may notice this and notify the user that something bizarre is going on. Offline attacks, if you download the password hashes from somebody's database because you've hacked their web server, you have the database now. You have all the hashes you need. You no longer have to be connected to that person's web server at all. You can do all the work of cracking those passwords offline with absolutely no communication back to the web server. Once you have all the passwords, then of course you can go off and verify they work. You can see what other web servers you can use them against. And the most important thing about cracking password hashes is it becomes the speed of cracking them is a time versus compute problem. And I say it's a time versus compute problem because the fast hashing algorithms like MD5 and SHA-1 can be calculated billions of times per second on modern hardware, particularly on GPUs like NVIDIA or ATI GPUs. So if I have 10 million passwords I have to crack and the passwords aren't very long, I can just have a machine run at it. I can use a distributed password cracker across 10 machines, all with GPUs. I can use a GPU cluster. I can rent GPU instances on Amazon and have those things spinning around trying to get me my password. So there's numerous ways of doing this. But the bottom line is, once somebody has your hashes, it's only a matter of time before they get your passwords. We talked about the hashing algorithm and how that controls the speed. So different methods of offline password recovery. The first one that most people will attempt is what's called a dictionary attack. And a dictionary attack is exactly what it sounds like. Somebody takes every single word from a dictionary and they use this offline cracker to basically try that password. They create a hash based upon it, and they say, does the hash of the word donkey match any of these users' hash that I have in this password file? If it does, boom, I got the person's password. I move on to the next one. Now, everyone knows we've always been told don't use dictionary words. And that's actually not that great advice, because most dictionary attacks are very simple in that they go after a one-word attack. So is your password donkey? Yes, I found your hash. But the idea of using passphrases is not single word, it's combinations of multiple words, which 99.9% of dictionary attacks will fail at because they're only trying one-word situations. After the dictionary attack is run, and by the way, dictionary attacks can occur very, very fast, billions of attempts per second. After a dictionary attack fails, or let's say only gets some number of passwords, then they'll move on to what's called a hybrid or mutated or rule-based attack. And what these are effectively is a combination of a dictionary attack plus some intelligence about how people create passwords. So a great example of this is most people will take a word and they'll add the number 1 to it, or the number 2, or the number 3. Like every time their password changes, they increment it by 1. A rule-based attack will find that very simply because they'll start out with the dictionary word and they'll add 0 through 9, or they'll even sometimes go up to 0 through 1,000, and they'll just keep incrementing. And these, again, are very, very fast to calculate because of MD5 and SHA-1. You can calculate billions of these hashes per second, and so it takes a very short amount of time to use one of these mutated rules and find a user's typical pattern of activity. In addition, they'll sometimes use rules to substitute out common substitutions. Because again, since we were told we had to use symbols, people would put an @ sign in for an A, or a 0 for an O, or a $ for an S. These are all common things people do to make the password complexity rules. Well, this is the same thing the attackers do to figure out how to mutate your password to strike gold without having to actually brute force the password. Then the last method is brute force. And brute force, a lot of people think brute force is something that's like super simple to do, and if I have a GPU and I have this distributed cluster, like I can crack any password in any amount of time. But this becomes a computational problem that, depending on the hashing algorithm, it may be impossible to crack a password via brute force that's any considerable length. So brute force, I say, is typically something that's a matter of last result. Basically how brute force works, as I said before, you try the letter A, then the letter B, C, D, whatever, and as they start getting longer, like this 5-character password, it just does this, A, and then it changes to B, C, D, all the way through the entire alphabet until you've tried every possible combination of uppercase, lowercase, numbers, symbols, whatever. The problem with brute force is this is really only good for passwords up to a maximum of about 6 to 8 characters. Beyond 6 to 8 characters, it becomes computationally impossible to do this, even across 1,000 computers with GPUs. It's too enormous of number of permutations that you can have with a long password. As I said, it's used only as a last resort. So what attackers will typically do is they'll do a dictionary attack, see how many they can find that way. Then they'll move on to a mutated rule attack. And then after that, they maybe achieved 60, 80%. Then if there's a certain user they really, really want, they might do a brute force to see if they can get it that way. So if the person used a short password, like 6, 7 characters, even if there's symbols and uppercase and lowercase and whatever, it will be found through brute force in a fairly short order of time, up to 6 to 8 characters. And by the way, as I said, the RockU and LinkedIn password links made the dictionary attack or the hybrid mutated rule attacks much more effective because people now had about 80 million examples of common password mechanisms. So they were able to basically build more intelligent rules based upon how people actually create passwords. So LinkedIn and RockU really made this process so much better.
Well, it seemed to me then, since most of us don't want to memorize 50 different passwords,
Right.
that if we just had one long password and then salted it with the name of the site we're going.
Well, you can't salt it as the consumer. Only the person protecting the password on the web server can salt it.
Well, you can do a fake salt. What it means is that you have, this is my strong password for that.
Right. Yeah, you can create your own random character tag at the end.
What I mean is, like, let's say we have a 12-digit password that we would use at 5 different sites. But
Right.
if we use those 12 digits and append to the end of it Google, LinkedIn, so on.
Yes.
That would make
You
them
can-
all hash differently.
You can, of course, do that. The only difficulty is if any one of them falls through any means because somebody uses a clear text database that somebody snags, they now know that your pattern is these 12 digits and the website name, and they just start trying all the other ones with the same pattern, they all fall.
Yeah.
So if you did something like that, but you somehow found a way of changing it up based upon the website, like you said, oh, if it's a website that starts with A through F, I'm going to append these letters. If it starts with this letter through this letter, I'm going to append this. Then at least only like a percentage of your sites would fall when one of them fell. The better solution in my mind, there's 2 things that can solve that better. One is use a password manager solution to generate unique long passwords, and then the second one is to use 2-factor. And we'll get to all that in just a minute. So the question is, does anyone know what this device is? Most of you probably think, yeah, it's a graphics card. It's a Radeon, ATI, AMD Radeon graphics card, which is absolutely right. The real answer is, in the context of this conversation, is a password cracking beast. Because these things are so much more effective than CPUs at calculating hashes. Anything that's computationally expensive, these things are incredibly good compared to a CPU. So what we used to be able to do for creating hashes within the CPU is now incredibly much more scalable on a GPU because these things are built for raw computational performance. By the way, this is one area that AMD pretty handily kills NVIDIA in terms of performance. If you're trying to crack passwords, the number of stream processors in an AMD Radeon is substantially better than that of the NVIDIA cards of their counterparts. And so if you're trying to do password cracking, everyone uses Radeons compared to typical gaming where NVIDIA typically has an edge. By the way, though, the recent NVIDIA Titan card is actually leveling the playing field on this quite a bit. So if you want to use NVIDIA hardware, the Titan is getting much closer to the Radeon in terms of raw performance. So if we talked to the last thing was a graphics card, is actually a password cracking thing, then what is this? Yeah, it's your worst nightmare, right? This is a GPU cluster of 8 Radeon 9700 cards. And this is, by the way, one of 4 chassis in a gentleman named Jeremy Gosme's GPU cluster. He has a open source implementation of Linux that allows him to use multiple GPUs in parallel for massively parallel password cracking. Now, Jeremy runs a company called Stricture Consulting Group, which if you ever do have to crack a password, I'd certainly recommend you look these guys up because they're probably some of the best in the industry at breaking passwords because they have a ridiculous amount of compute power at their disposal. And they're also very, very skilled in creating those mutated rules to help the passwords fall very, very quickly. So as I said, if you ever need to do some password discovery in your own environment, definitely look at hiring those guys. In the case of Jeremy's hardware, this is one of, as I said, like 4 boxes. There's actually a total of 25 Radeon GPUs in his cluster, so you can do incredibly massive parallel cracking. So we said this is one node. They can do 350 billion attempts against NTLM hashes. So this is pretty impressive, 350 billion per second. He can also break every 8-character NTLM password in 5.5 hours. So if you're using NTLM in your environment, within 5.5 hours, anything up to 8 characters would fall with his hardware. So pretty impressive. And this is, I want to get back to hashing a little bit to talk about when we talked about the different methods. So the hardware that he's using can do 350 billion guesses per second against NTLM. It can do 180 billion for MD5. It can do 63 billion for SHA-1 and 364,000 per second for SHA-512 crypt, and only 71,000 for bcrypt. So when I talked before about using computationally expensive hashing algorithms, this is why you want to do it. Because if this guy's trying to get your password and the website has created their hashing solution using bcrypt, it's going to take him a really long time to get your passwords. And if he's trying to crack the passwords of 30 million people, it could be years or tens of years before he gets through all of them, even with the kind of compute power that he has. And a good example of this, there's a gentleman named Megatron that took password lists from CoreLogic and cracked 122 million passwords that were a combination of MD5 and SHA-1 using a single Radeon 5770. Now, if you guys know the Radeon hardware level, 5770 is like a couple of years old at this point. But over a period of 5 months, using John the Ripper and OCL Hashcat Plus, he was able to get 122 million passwords off of a common password list off the internet. So this is why I say the hashing speed is a factor of time and compute power, and they will fall as long as they're not super long. So as the best thing you can do is make your passwords really long. And the unfortunate reality is you can assume that most online passwords are protected by MD5 or SHA-1. Why? Because it's the easiest one for people to implement. Everyone does it. It doesn't mean it's the best. It's just what people typically do. So whenever you have identities on the internet, you can assume they're protected by MD5 or SHA-1. Maybe this is something you can ask your providers when you're signing up for things if you have a line to their InfoSec people. Even without a GPU cluster, you can break password hashes if you have enough time. So as I said, that gentleman Megatron did crack 122 passwords over 5 months. Now 5 months is a long time, but given the amount of times people change their passwords, they might have the same password 5 months later. You never know. So let's talk about multi-factor authentication. Some of the very basic stuff, multi-factor is this. It's something you know, which is your username and your password, and it's something that you have. And in some cases, that something you have could be a smart card, could be a USB dongle, could be a pseudocode generating token, could be your mobile phone, could be a soft token, which could also be your smartphone, could be a secret printed code on a piece of paper. And then the third factor that you could be using as well is something that you are. Now, I don't talk too much about the something that you are because these are biometric things, and some people are a little weird about biometric authentication because biometric is either going to be, of course, your fingerprint, a retina scan, something like that. The big concerns or worries about biometric scanning is if somebody duplicates your fingerprint or somebody duplicates your retina, how do you ever recover an option for that? I mean, it's not like you can just like pop your eye out and get a new retina. You know, at that point in time, you're kind of sunk. They've got your other factor. Now, of course, chances are someone's not going to be able to steal your retina very easily. Your fingerprint can definitely be lifted quite easily, so you got to question using biometrics. So fingerprint, retina scan, good examples of biometric. So what is two-factor good for? The most important thing is preventing a stolen credential that we've just talked about for the last 40 minutes, somebody getting your password, preventing them from being able to use it without your knowledge. It's the most important thing two-factor protects you against. It doesn't mean your password's not going to fall. Your password could still fall, but when they try to use that password to log into the site as you, it's not going to work because they'll need that two-factor code. Now, if the attacker is determined enough and they're going to go after, like in the case of Matt Honan, go after your email account and this and that, whatever, they may find ways to subvert the two-factor by getting social engineering somebody to giving you the code or something like that. So there are ways of getting around it, but generally speaking, it will prevent somebody with a stolen password from using your site. Another important thing is it may raise awareness that somebody is attempting to use your accounts, which could then prompt you, of course, to go in and change the password, talk to the security team at the company, say, hey, somebody's trying to attack my account, what can you do? Those kind of things. The most important thing, and a lot of us here are people that do terminal services or VDI type projects, it is very effective for protecting an out-of-band service. When I mean out-of-band is, it's like if you authenticate to some service via a web browser, and then what you actually connect to the resource with is a secondary process that is not tied to the web, like a client for a VDI or terminal server environment. It is very difficult for somebody to steal anything from you through the web browser when it's a secondary process that launches and connects you to that resource. It's very hard without compromising the machine itself to get at that data. So when somebody has a compromised password for a website, they can of course go out to that website and try to use it outside of your logon session. If they compromise your two-factor identity or compromise your password and you're using a terminal server or a VDI desktop, they can't easily get at the data inside your session unless they screen record the stuff, right? They could do a screen recording if they had some malware on your machine. But screen recording is very difficult to decode and repiece together. You can do a replay from some graphical data, but it's not as easy as replaying some TCP data from a web browser or something like that. So it is much more effective to protect a terminal server or display remoting scenario than it is to protect a web server instance. Because if somebody does compromise your browser in some way, they can easily man in the middle your TCP communication with the browser, or they can do man in the browser attack and look at all of the communication with your web browser to the remote web servers, and they can easily capture details from there or do replay attacks, whatever the case may be. So protecting something that uses display remoting is a much better secure scenario. So what is two-factor not good for? As I said, protecting online websites and banking. It's a horrible, horrible idea to use two-factor protect online banking. Why? Because the greatest threat we face today is your email client and your web browser. Those are the two most likely places that you will fall, either from a drive-by download or somebody's emailing you something that you click on and your machine becomes compromised. Once that happens, it's very easy for somebody to inject into your communication with the web server and man in the middle of your communication. So if I own the communication between you and your banking site, guess what? I can do transfers. Let's say you open your banking site and then you go to a new tab and do some other stuff. Meanwhile, I'm running some JavaScript that is interacting with your banking site, transferring money, doing all sorts of crazy stuff, and you have no knowledge because you're not actually watching it. Whereas if you're on a terminal server session or a virtual desktop, it is a lot harder to try to automate and inject traffic into a display protocol without the user noticing, right? Very tough to do that. Whereas at the banking site, not so effective.
So, that also depends on how you implement it. You implement it for authentication, which is basically the same as having a password in a session cookie. It's the same thing as banking. You use it for authentication and not for verification after you have done the other.
I'm not talking about session hijacking. I'm just saying once you're logged into the banking site, if you stay logged in and go to another tab, you still have a session with that server. So I'm not talking about cross-site scripting or something like that. I'm saying if there's malware on that machine, it can run code against that browser tab without you even knowing the code's running.
That's what I'm saying is that depending on how the implementation of the two-factor authentication, if you require
of course,
every action you do, which
yes,
banks actually have real two-factor authentication do, then you go around that and you actually do add the protection.
Sure.
If you have a tab that somebody's running code on in the background, no matter what kind of code it is, if the user kind of kept getting into saying, we want you to code again,
right,
code again,
right.
then they would, so
sadly,
websites, the banking sites that don't use two-factor authentication, like most banks in the US,
yeah.
that's kind of a joke.
Sadly, 90% of them don't.
Yeah, well, here, yeah.
In the US, yeah. But if we were all that concerned about security, we'd probably have credit cards that had smart chips and Europay model and that kind of stuff, but we're light years behind that. So anyway, so it's not good for banking, at least in the US, because they're not robust enough to track for those kind of things. So we talked a little bit about man in the middle, somebody relaying your traffic, hijacking your session, and replaying attacks against your communication as you're doing it between you and the web server. And this is basically a network-based intercept. So it could be Wi-Fi in a cafe, somebody gets your mobile phone or tablet, they inject in the communication, they capture your session cookie, and then they start performing their own replay transactions against your banking system. Man in the browser is basically you've got some form of malware sitting on your web browser, and then they can then perform synthetic transactions against your banking website from your machine that's been compromised. One of the most effective ways you can try to avoid being compromised using online banking is to simply use a completely out-of-band mechanism. So if you use your web browser for all your normal daily browsing and you think that there might be something wrong with your machine, use a different machine, use your mobile phone, use your tablet, use something that you suspect is less likely to be compromised, and make sure that that's being done out of band of that machine. So we talked about it's easier to be unaware of a web browser that's compromised than it is to be unaware of somebody trying to emulate display remoting. So it's a good way of protecting it. So protecting the consumer, make sure you're using HTTPS against all web-based transactions that you're using, preferably not just for logon, but for the entire session. So Twitter, Facebook, all these websites now have configuration settings that you can turn on SSL encryption. Many of them have now made it a default because of all the different compromises that have occurred. Make sure all your sites are using HTTPS for that. Make sure you delete saved hotspots from mobile devices to protect against the Wi-Fi pineapple man-in-the-middle attack. Don't use any open, non-encrypted Wi-Fi if possible. Of course, most of you are probably sitting on McCormick Place unencrypted Wi-Fi right now, but generally speaking, it's a bad idea. If you're ever out in Las Vegas during Black Hat or DEF CON, I strongly recommend not using the hotel Wi-Fi at those events. Just a suggestion. Or the other thing is, if you're going to use open Wi-Fi, always make sure you initiate a VPN tunnel as soon as your Wi-Fi comes up. That way, everything that you're doing is being tunneled back to your corporate environment. There's less risk of it being compromised. Never insert USB drives you find laying around. As we said, USB rubber ducky, all sorts of malware can be installed in your machine by simply putting it in there. From a consumer perspective, there's a website out there called Pwned List, and Pwned is basically leet speak for you've been owned. We have your credentials, we have your banking, we have whatever. Pwned List was set up by a couple security researchers, and it is actually a legit website. It's not like some place for people to steal your stuff. How Pwned List basically works is this. They are monitoring disclosure lists constantly of people that are posting up password lists online of, we just hacked LinkedIn, we've got 50 million passwords, we hacked Evernote, we got this, whatever. And they're downloading those lists and they're putting them into their system to track whose email accounts and whose passwords have been found. If you register with an account with Pwned List, and you can, by the way, use a temporary email account or get a brand new Gmail that you don't have it tied to anything else. They will let you put up to 3 email addresses in their system, and they will monitor those 3 email addresses to see if they appear anywhere on a compromised list of passwords. And if you're concerned about supplying your email to Pwned List because you're worried like, oh geez, if I give that to them and they get compromised and someone has my email account, that's of course you might get spammed, but you're not giving them your password, you're just giving them your email address. But if you're paranoid about that, create a brand new account at Google that has nothing to do with the rest of your accounts, and then use an online SHA-512 generator to create a SHA-512 hash of the emails you want them to monitor. Because what they do is they'll take all the email account names that are found, they'll SHA-512 hash them, and they'll use that to compare it against their list. So you paste in the SHA-512 hash of all your email accounts, and they will notify you if one of those is found online as being compromised. So it's a great way of keeping your personal identity somewhat secure. Yes?
One of the things on the first one, to go back to slide.
Yep.
One of the big problems with number 1 there is 4 or 5 years ago, Citibank got hit, and they actually had a symbol, a verified SSL certificate stamp on their website, but the actual traffic was not encrypted.
Yeah.
So they put that out there because that was they're saying, oh, we're secure, but we didn't pay for an SSL certificate to go to our site.
Right.
So people have to remember that they have to see that actual HTTPS or that box symbol.
Yeah, and I got to say that that's a really good point. And honestly, Firefox and Chrome are a lot better than IE is in terms of really letting you know for sure the certificate is valid. Yeah. Well, not only that, but Chrome will also, and actually Firefox does as well, will sort of like tell you, we can't verify the certificate. Are you sure you want to continue? Or you want to add this as an exception, whatever. They're really making you subvert the fact that you're trying to go through something that's not secure. So a very good example of that. And by the way, this is also true of like your mobile devices. If you get the little pop-up that says, cannot verify server identity when you're connected to something, don't click ignore. And it's sad because iOS, the default highlighted one says ignore. And there was a research I saw last year at DEF CON where a guy had picked apart the Exchange ActiveSync protocol and found ways with a Wi-Fi Pineapple to get a nearby person trying to talk to their Exchange ActiveSync server. He used Wi-Fi Pineapple to intercept the traffic, and then he basically relayed the communication back to their Exchange server. And as soon as a person connected, their phone would pop up and say, you know, identity of this service certificate cannot be validated. And of course, 90% of users go, okay, ignore. And at that point in time, they are now relaying through his man in the middle back to the Exchange server. At that point in time, then he can go to his tool and say, remote wipe. Hit a button, the person's phone reboots, it's gone, it's empty. So incredibly important that you don't ignore security warnings that come up on your mobile phone.
And one reason why people do that is because they're so used to it, because if they sit in a hotel room connected to Wi-Fi,
Yeah.
it's going to go to the register page of the Wi-Fi first, and while they do that, the Outlook will, whatever email is going to pop up saying that
Right.
I'm trying to go somewhere else, and then, okay, yeah.
That's why I always tell people if you're ever in doubt, you know, don't do it from your mobile phone, get on a PC, try to get a VPN tunnel established. At least then someone, you know, you've got the encryption protecting from the VPN perspective, so it's better.
And it's also, I mean, there's one thing that's started to get way more common now, because again, it's something that people don't understand, is compromising the job app instead.
Yeah.
Leave the web page is, but exchange the job app instead.
Yeah.
Because people don't understand what to get stuff that say that the job app has incorrect certificate or whatever it is.
Right.
They don't understand it and just being okay. So leave the page as is, but they just replace the job
Yeah.
app in the background.
Many, many ways to compromise through the browser, and people don't pay attention to that.
There was one comment about the
Yes.
VPN thing. At least my corporate VPN seems to VPN all traffic to the corporate network,
Right.
not traffic that's destined elsewhere.
Right, yeah, VPNs can be set up to either allow split tunneling or not to allow split tunneling. So depending on how you're configured, you do have a potential risk if you're communicating with local resources. And that's usually what I tell people, to make sure that you're using some kind of a local firewall that prevents outbound connections to things that you're not aware of what they are. Because if you at least have a local firewall, you can prevent some of that stuff. Yes?
How do you educate the public for things like the certificates and that? I had a problem 4 or 5 months ago connecting to my ISP, trying to find out if their certificate is expired.
Right.
Well, the Yahoo I was talking to said, well, just click ignore, don't worry about it. And I said, well, do you have a problem with your certificate? Well, we don't know, but just click ignore. And
Yeah.
they're telling the general public.
Yeah, the unfortunate reality is a lot of times there's bad advice that's given, and most regular users don't know enough about the security implications to know if what they're doing is a good or bad practice. So it's unfortunately one of those things that it's impossible to necessarily educate. There are some emerging solutions on the market like Bromium that can provide better protection against those type of things, but those are of course geared towards enterprise, not towards consumer. So it's a very big problem, and it almost can't be fixed with education, because people always tell people to ignore things. So it's a big problem, and I don't have an answer for that, unfortunately. One thing you can do is use a password manager to create unique and long passwords per site. This is one of the most effective things you can do to ensure every password has its own unique, every site has its own unique password, and if somebody compromises one of them, they're not going to have your identity compromised on all of them. So there's an online-based solution, which is LastPass. There are offline encrypted solutions like 1Password, PWSafe, KeePass. The key differentiator of these two is LastPass is an online hosted service, meaning if LastPass themselves are compromised, potentially so are your passwords. Now, they do encrypt the passwords that are stored with their site. That doesn't mean that there's no risk that they can't be compromised or that your passwords can't be compromised. So the thing I tell people is, if you're going to use something like LastPass, use it for all your websites. Don't use it for your online banking. Don't use it for anything that would have any real financial risk if it was in fact compromised. You can also use an offline encrypted password database. The problem with these is it's not always easy to use if you're crossing multiple machines. You can, of course, stick one of these password databases inside of Dropbox or something like that, but then you got the data being littered all over the place, and whether that's going to be secure or not, it's up to your own personal posture. Never reuse passwords. Most important takeaway from this: don't ever reuse passwords on different websites. Ideally, if the website allows it, create unique user account names that are not the same across the different sites. Now, sometimes this is not possible because the website will use your email account. You don't have the ability to create a unique account without creating a new unique email account. But if the website uses a user name field, make sure it doesn't match, like Shawn Bass or S Bass or something like that, then an attacker is going to be able to try the very first time he compromises that account name somewhere else, make it something unique and random that they will not be able to use the same username and pass you through to other websites. Do not store passwords in unencrypted places. As I mentioned, Evernote as an example. There is a way of storing some secure text in Evernote, but all of the regular contents are not encrypted. So set up two-factor authentication where possible. I've created links here that shows you how to set up two-factor authentication on a majority of the different websites like Twitter, Google services in Gmail, Facebook, Dropbox, Evernote, LastPass, iCloud. All of these are capable of using two-factor authentication. Many of them either use your mobile phone as an SMS, or they'll use something like Google Authenticator, which is a free, open, OAuth-compatible two-factor solution that uses a soft token on the mobile phone. So all these solutions are basically free. You just have to go out there and set them up. Now, one of the things that people might be a little bit concerned about with the two-factor solution is, what if I can't get to it, like I don't have my mobile phone with me or something like that? Many of these do allow you to have either a backup mobile phone or a backup secure email or a backup printed code that you can use. We're completely out? Oh. So a lot of these have alternate ways that you can store a backup method of getting in, or you can set up a way of getting secure email, as I said. One thing that might be potentially bad is if you want to share the account between multiple people. This may be a problem, like if your wife has access to your email account or your husband has access to your email account, they may not be able to read your email without you being aware and giving them the code, which I'm not entirely sure is a bad thing, but just keep that in mind if you are account sharing. So unfortunately, I did not get a chance to get through the protecting the business. When you guys get the slides, I have many different two-factor solutions like Smart Card, RSA, Duo Push, Duo Security, Duo Push, lots of others. Unfortunately, I ran out of time to cover those, but I've got information in here, sort of like what the pros and cons are of each of those technology approaches, what's good about them, what's bad about them. So I apologize I ran out of time, but thank you so much for your time today. Appreciate it.